Welcome to the 44th Meeting House, and especially welcome to the opportunity to step back in time more than 200 years. The Meeting House was built in 1807, and what is so remarkable about the Meeting House, it has been largely unchanged. So when you visit the Meeting House, you're going to have an opportunity to sit where the early colonists sat for their worship services. It's always an absolutely wonderful ambiance and a very peaceful atmosphere. So we do encourage you to come on any Sunday. We are open from 1 to 3, starting the Memorial Day weekend through the end of September. My name is Nancy Likas. I am co-chair of the docent committee for the Preservation Committee of the 44th Meeting House. Nancy Mebane and I share the responsibilities. Matt Schooley is president of the Cemetery Association, and you will meet him a little bit later on. And Tony Brooks is also here, who is going to perhaps tell you some of the important reasons why the Meeting House is so important to the area. Now, when you come to the Meeting House, I always encourage people to sit down in one of the pews, because you will get the full experience of what it would have been like to attend a worship service back here. We claim 1807 as our founding date because the first service was held in the incompleted church. Now, the final completion date was probably June 1st of 1808. But since we had the first service here, when the roof was on, the sides were up, then certainly we feel entitled to claim that we are well over 200 years old. You may be a little curious as to why it took so long for the early settlers to build a permanent house of worship, because we know just how important their faith was to them. Well, you have to stop to think that when the first 40 settlers came down from Connecticut in 1769, this was Western frontier. There wasn't anything here. They had to form a new settlement and, of course, had to build a fort for protection. All of that would have been enough, but then they also had to deal with the Yankees because the ownership had given the same land to the colony of Connecticut first, later on the same land to the colony of Pennsylvania. So when the settlers came down to try and establish the area for Connecticut, obviously they met with a great deal of opposition. So you have the fact that it was Western frontier and wilderness, carving out a settlement, dealing with the Yankees as far as the property disputes. Then along came the American Revolution, and then finally, after the Revolution and the property was decided that it was going to be Pennsylvania, not Connecticut, but at least you could stay on your land and you would be entitled to the ownership. Things got a lot more peaceful. By 1806, the area had changed to a prosperous farming community, and the settlers chose a building committee. One of their responsibilities, of course, was to hire the workers, but they also had to secure pledges in order to fulfill the financial obligation. Luke Swetland, patriarch of the Swetland family. Lazarus Dennison, oldest son of Nathan and Betsy Dennison. Benjamin Dorrance, Daniel Hoyt, and Elijah Shoemaker Jr., all names that were certainly part of the first 40 families. The committee hired Joseph Hitchcock, who was originally from New Haven, Connecticut, as the builder / architect, if you will. And they hired Gideon Underwood, who is originally from Plainfield, Connecticut, as the master carpenter cabinet maker. Gideon is the one who is credited with the interior work of the pews and this wonderful pulpit that we have that is elevated 12 feet above the floor. You can just imagine attending a service here and hearing the booming voice of Reverend Ard Hoyt, the very first pastor delivering his sermon. Interestingly enough, the meeting house was built as a union church or a union chapel. It was built for the Congregationalists, who later became Presbyterian, and it was also built for the Methodists. While they built it together, they did not worship together. They alternated Sundays. So, if you'll come with me, I have a list of the pastors and lay leaders who have served the congregations here. As you see on the list, there are many more Methodists than there are Congregationalists or Presbyterian. One of the reasons for that is when there wasn't an ordained pastor available to celebrate the service, lay speakers would be involved. And this was very much part of the Methodist circuit. You've probably heard of the riders on horseback or the circuit riders. This circuit actually started down around Northumberland on up through Mashopin, and this was the center or rallying point for the Methodists. And incidentally, Nathan Dennison was known for being willing to host the traveling preachers on horseback. We also have the alms boxes. We have one original alms box. This is how the collection would have been taken up. This is actually a replica that was done after the flood. You've certainly heard of the flood of 1972 and the destruction that occurred then. The meeting house, thanks to God's providence, was really spared major structural damage. But that is a replica because one of the alms boxes disintegrated in the flood water. But this is an original alms box here. The area underneath the pulpit is where the clerk or the deacon would have been seated. One of his responsibilities may have been to control the hourglass. And of course, when the hour passed, he would turn it over, and the congregation would know how much time had elapsed. But obviously, the pastor, who was 12 feet above him, wouldn't be able to see the hourglass, and it wouldn't have meant anything anyway because he was going to preach his sermon no matter how long it took, and it might be 2 to 3 hours in length. Obviously, it would be a little difficult to pay attention for that period of time, but one of the church officers was called a tithing man, having nothing to do with the percent of your donation from your income that you would be giving to the church. A tithing man carried a rod about this long, and on one end had a feather, and on the other end had a hard ball. Now, if you were a woman who was maybe dozing off, or maybe the tithing man thought you weren't paying attention, you might get a tickle on your cheek or maybe on your nose. That would certainly wake you up. But if you were a gentleman and not paying attention, or heaven forbid that you had fallen asleep, you'd get a hard knock on your head, much to the amusement of all the people seated around you. Now, we mentioned Reverend Hoyt. He's described as a very tall man, over 6 feet tall. No shades of gray with Reverend Hoyt. He was a strict disciplinarian, and he would let the congregation know exactly how he felt. So sermons are described as a mixture of fire and brimstone tempered with piety and humility. Reverend Hoyt stayed as pastor here for 11 years before moving to Tennessee, where he was a missionary to Cherokee Indians. And Reverend Hoyt also served the Congregationalists on the west side of the river. You've probably noticed that the style of the church is very plain. When the building committee was selected, obviously they would have had input from their families, and it was decided that they wanted to reflect their Puritan New England roots. So actually, we have a little piece of New England right here in Wyoming Valley. We are the first completed church in the entire northeastern Pennsylvania, And I would say, without equivocation, it's the only one that has been unchanged in all that time. The construction was done by Mr. Hitchcock, as we said, using the square rule of architecture. This was something that was new during this time period. Up until then, it had been scribe rule, where it almost seems like trial and error. But with the square rule, every piece was drawn to specifications, measurements were taken, precise measurements were taken, and as many pieces were made alike as possible, so that when it was laid out on the ground in the pattern and then raised, it wouldn't have to be taken down again. I think the fact that it has remained standing for all these years with very little damage to it is an excellent testament to Mr. Hitchcock's skill as an architect. The New England meeting houses were very typical as far as the design was concerned. Congregationalists in particular would not have wanted any outward icons, so no distractions from their worship services. So when you look at the pulpit, for example, what appear to be representations of the cross. You can pick up very clearly 3 crosses. Some people say representing the Trinity, but it's believed it was just the architectural convention of the time because the Congregationalists would have opposed even the use of those icons. The building itself is constructed of native white pine. Material was brought on the grounds in the winter of 1806, and construction would have been started as soon as the weather broke in 1807. The pews, native white pine, originally were very light-colored. As you see, they are dark now, and it is naturally darkened with age. There's a clear gloss protective coat on them, but that wasn't done until the 1970s. So it's just amazing how these pews have certainly stood the test of time. It's believed that the pulpit is constructed of black walnut, which would be the only difference between the pulpit and the pews, because not the same wood was used. And the long supporting beams that you see are oak. So otherwise you have the native white pine, the oak beams, and the walnut pulpit. Just a word about the gallery while we're looking up there is that if you could not afford to contribute to the church, or maybe the family pew was full, then you had to sit upstairs. There were 3 rows of backless benches up there, so if you were seated in the 3rd row of the gallery, you could just barely see maybe the forehead of the pastor, and you didn't even have anything to support your back. Now we have a full cellar underneath the meeting house because it was determined that if we didn't do something, that eventually the meeting house would probably not be able to bear the weight of the construction because the 2 corners were sinking. But originally it was a 3-foot crawl space. There was a stone foundation and the 3-foot crawl space, and this was the entrance to the crawl space, which is now the entrance to the cellar. The cellar was put in 2007 when we had the major work done on the meeting house. In the back corner, we do have a storage area underneath the steps, but it seems to me it would be better served as the entrance to the cellar. Certainly you wouldn't have to duck to get down in there. And if there aren't even steps to go down, it's just a step ladder. The floorboards are anywhere from 6 to 27 inches. Originally the floor was not painted. It probably wasn't painted till almost 1900. But you can imagine they didn't want to waste any of the pieces of the wood that they had. Everything is being done by hand. This is what's so amazing to me. When you look at the hand turnings on the columns, for example, no 2 are exactly alike, indicating that it wasn't terribly precise, but they did the best that they could with the implements that they were using. Now, I want to point out the circle, the vent that is in the ceiling of the meeting house. Our interpretive manual talks about the fact that it would have been a vent for an early heating source, believed to be a wood-burning stove here in the middle aisle. And it was about 2 years ago that a gentleman from New Jersey had visited, who's a building inspector by trade and studies architecture as a hobby. So he looked all around and he said, there's no indication on the floor that there was ever a wood stove here, because certainly you would need an iron piece to put underneath the stove, otherwise you're going to have too much heat and burn your stove, burn your floor. Plus, he said, on the sides of the pews, there's no indication of this heat that would have been radiating out on the sides. And if it had been there, he said, you would certainly notice it. So he said, come over here. And he stopped at this column. And he said, if you look up in the ceiling, you'll see a hook to the right of the vent. And I said, yes, I knew the hook was there, but I never really thought about why it was there. And then he pointed out this round hole in the column that had been plugged. It's a piece of wood that's plugging it. And he also pointed out the fact that this is ridged. And he said, rub your hand gently along the surface of the column. And he said, you'll feel that it is ridged. And he said, I don't think you had a stove in the middle of your aisle. I think what you had was a candle-burning chandelier. This would have been the crank to raise and lower the chandelier, so that obviously you would need to light the candles and then raise it for the service, lower the chandelier to extinguish the candles afterward, which makes sense to us, but we're still wondering, would you really need a vent for a candle-burning chandelier? How high up is it going to go? Would you really need a chimney? Because there was a central chimney at one particular time. Bit of a mystery, so we're hoping that sometime someone will come to visit who can definitively tell us exactly what we did have. I should like to point out the windows, the 12 over 12 panes, definitely colonial style, and many of the glass panes are original. We always tell visitors that the parts that you can't see through very well are original glass. Some is restoration glass, and of course if it's clear glass, that obviously comes from modern times. We talk about the fact that the meeting house is mostly unchanged. We do have two, what you might call major changes, because typical New England meeting houses had doors on either side. In addition to your main door, you would have had a door on the right and the door on the left, because the ladies came in one side of the church and sat on one side of the aisle, and the gentlemen came in the other side. So where these windows are originally were doors. Another mystery, because we don't know exactly when those doors were closed in and the windows put in. We do know that there definitely were doors. Steuben Jenkins, speaking here in 1888, said, I remember when there were doors on either side of the meeting house. And we have pictures of New England meeting houses that definitely show the two doors. It was thought that the doors were enclosed when the coal-burning stoves were added. These are cannon barrel style coal-burning stoves manufactured in Providence, which is now part of Scranton, by Henry Silkman's company. Henry Silkman had a very successful business, which he started in 1860, and operated until 1868 when it burned, and he never rebuilt it. So we're dating the stoves from those years. We unfortunately don't have any records as to when they were actually installed, but it makes sense to us they were here at least by 1865, because there is reference in the minutes of the Cemetery Association stating that the sexton was supposed to fix the stovepipe at the meeting house. Again, another mystery. We hope eventually that we'll have the material to determine exactly what year the stoves were installed. You might wonder why the meeting house is in its more or less original condition. I guess we could say maybe a little benign neglect, because by the late 1830s, both congregations had grown to the size where they wanted to build their own separate churches. So by the probably mid-1840s, this church was not being used on a regular basis. We think probably there were funerals here, maybe some weddings, maybe some public meetings. We're not really sure because we have no records. But it's really been a benefit to us to be able to show the meeting house in its more or less original state. So we'll say for about 18, 20 years, the meeting house was used only occasionally. William Swetland, who was the grandson of Luke Swetland, became concerned because the place needed painting, it needed a new roof, fence around the cemetery was not in very good repair. So with his own money, he had all of this work done, a very philanthropic man. And it was a few short years after that that the Cemetery Association was formed. That was in 1860. And that's the entity that owns the 44th Meeting House and is responsible for its upkeep. Lindsay Kuhn Robinson was president of the Cemetery Association in the early 1990s. She was getting concerned because, again, the meeting house needed work. She realized that she was going to have to form an ad hoc committee of the Cemetery Association in order to raise money to get the funds to do it. So in 1991, she started the 44th Meeting House Preservation Committee, and they consulted restoration experts so they would not compromise the historical value of the meeting house with any work that was done. And I think at that time, they even discovered that a family of groundhogs had found a new home as far as the meeting house was concerned. They got in through an opening in the foundation somehow. So obviously, work needed. Again, painting, I'm not sure if the new roof was put on at that time, but certainly there has been a roof put on since that time. Then, of course, the flood came along in 1972. Well, and that was one of the reasons for forming the Preservation Committee, because of the work that had, the damage that had been done in the cemetery when fully a third of the cemetery had been lost to the flood. There were over 2,500, 2,700 graves had been lost in the flood. Fortunately, the meeting house was spared a great deal of damage. A very large tree had been felled by the force of the water, and it's believed that it might have diverted some of the force away from the meeting house. Again, God's providence wanted the meeting house to be saved, so we certainly give a great deal of credit to the Lord Almighty. They hired the services of John Milner Associates, and Milner is a firm from Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania. They're considered the foremost firm in this country, at least, if not the world, as far as preservation plans for historic locations. And as you can see, it's quite detailed as to just what needed to be done and how to go about doing it. So that's why in 2007, we had the new foundation dug. ensuring a firm foundation for at least another 200 years. And we even have pictures that were taken from underneath the meeting house, and you can very clearly see the marks from the handheld axe when they were shaping the timbers, the supporting timbers. And then again in 2009, we had more restoration done. The shutters were all restored, I guess you could call it, and painted, and the meeting house was painted as well. So we're hoping that for another 200 years, with the exception of having to paint the meeting house, maybe put a new roof on from time to time, that we will be able to entertain visitors and they'll have the experience of coming to worship here. In the building construction, I wanted to point out the original 5-panel doors and also the original lock and the original key. This is actually the key that we use to open the meeting house when we give the tours. And appropriately enough, the teeth of the key form a cross. The church presently is open for tours on Sundays, as we said. We do offer special tours on other days. If you have visitors coming from out of town and they can't be here on Sunday, then just call the cemetery number. You'll get my number as a reference, and we, if at all possible, will accommodate you with a tour of the meeting house. It's a nominal charge of $2 for adults, $1 for children. We do have a small gift shop that does provide us with some funds. But we are truly grateful that we have this opportunity to preserve the meeting house, to honor the people who came before us in Wyoming Valley, to honor all of the hard work that they did, to honor their faith, and to further make sure that they are not forgotten as well. So please plan to come and visit us. Thank you so much.